Okay, so yeah, welcome to the Deep Dive Lightning Talks. So there's a lot of experienced developers out there and maybe a few newcomers, but no matter what your skill level, there's always something new to learn about Plex. So we've got 3 speakers for these talks, and between us, we've got, well, close to 50 years of experience. And yeah, we're happy to share our experience on these topics. So I'm Andrew Leggett from CM First, and I'm going to start with a talk on metacode. And then I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, Abram Darnitzer, again from CM First, who's going to be going to depth about SQL queries. And then finally, Kiyoshi, again from CM First, who's going to teach us all about the model API. So I'm looking to learn from those talks. So as Abram said, if you have questions, there's like a chat window. There's also the raise your hand. We'll deal with the questions at the end. So yeah, I'll get going. So let me just switch to this one. Okay, so I'll get started on metacode. So yes, I've been using Plex for about 25 years, and I think metacode's only something I really got into in the last maybe 10, 15 years. I know some developers see it and just ignore it. So I'm just going to try and encourage you to kind of give it a go and try and get the benefits from it. So metacode effectively writes your code for you. So you can create flexible, reusable, consistent patterns that can cut down your development effort. And so I'm going to take a look at just the basics. Obviously, it's a lightning talk, so I'm not going to go into a lot of depth, but I'll try to introduce you to just the basic concepts. And we'll look at a practical example, and I'll share some tips along the way. Okay, so I'll skip past me. So what is metacode? And it's code that runs at generation time. So when you're doing your generation on generation window, that's when it's running. So you see it in your action diagram, and it does whatever it's told to do. So it's got the ability to query the model. So it knows about triples, about the model configuration, about inheritance path of various objects. So depending on the triples and all those things, it can generate different code. So it's effectively a language within a language. So you've got your action diagram code, which you're all familiar with, but then you can have metacode that can generate additional action diagram code. And it's platform independent in that it doesn't really matter if you're generating Java or C++. Metacode will just run the same. Doesn't matter what the platform is. So why do we have metacode? So it probably goes back historically to about the time when originally there was 2E, and 2E has its templates. So commonly used operations like edit record, for example, where it works in a fixed way, and then developers can insert their code at various points, but beyond that, it's kind of fixed. So with Plex came the selling point that you could make it ultimately infinitely flexible. You can generate code conditionally based on what's in the model, and we use it all the time. You may be not aware of it. If you have prompt processing, if you've got a entity refers to another entity, then it's metacode that goes through and determines which select function to call at runtime for whatever field. So there's a lot of that in the patterns. And the metacode provides consistency. So you can inherit it, and you can regenerate it, and you make changes in the model, and it'll regenerate the code based on those changes. And if used well, it can vastly reduce the lines of handwritten code. So that's always a good thing. So why aren't we all metacoding? Well, it's complicated. As you can see from here, it's not always clear what exactly it's doing. So it takes a bit of time, bit of effort to kind of get your head around it. So it's not easy, but it's not as scary as you might think. So I know even experienced developers tend to just ignore it, but it's there and it's there to be used. So you just need to have a different mindset. So the main thing to really understand is that it's at generation time, not runtime. So once you've learned the basic concepts, it's quite easy to sort of put together some metacode, and when you do get it to work, it's quite satisfying to actually get the results you're expecting. So I'm just going to teach a few basics here. So you see all the metacode operations, all the statements, and they all start with pluses. There is a logic behind that. So the single pluses are just for constructs like conditions and loops, etc. So one you may have seen or may have even used is plus for each field, which will loop through each field in a specific variable. Then you have plus plus, and anywhere you see a plus plus, the metacode will generate code. So it'll generate Java or RPG, depending on what you're actually generating. So if you have a plus plus call statement, then it will generate a call statement at that point. And then you would have a meta variable with the function that you're going to call in there. And then you have your plus plus pluses, which are anything that works with meta variables. And we'll talk about those next. So meta variables are just temporary variables used at generation time. So you can use any model object as a variable. So I've got an example here. I have a field called debug. It doesn't really need that plus on it. It's just I normally put a plus on a field if I'm going to be using it only for meta operations. And I have the name object debug as well. I can use either of these in my code. It works the same way. So you can just pick any object that is meaningful. And meta variables are either defined or undefined. So if you don't define it in the first place, it's undefined. And anywhere where you're checking it with a plus if, then if it's undefined, it will not generate what's inside that plus if statement. But if you do use a plus 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 define, then in this case, if you do plus subroutine, it will generate what's inside that if statement. And you can explicitly undefine a variable with the undefine statement. And with meta variables, you can assign any object in the model to a meta variable. And then from that point, you can query its triples, inheritance path, and other things. So an example here, I want to work with the edit detail entity, and I can assign that to a meta variable called plus entity. So the meta operations, so I've mentioned the plus if. So the plus if meta variable will only generate if the variable is defined. I can also do conditions, so I can compare one meta variable to another. And again, if it's true, the condition, then it will generate what's inside the if statement. And these conditions can be greater than, less than, all the other comparisons there. Another one, plus for each field, just a loop that goes through each field in a variable, and then you can do whatever you want with those fields, and I'll show you a practical example for that coming up. The plus for defined value is a useful one if you want to query a particular object. So I can assign maybe a function to this plus function meta field, and then within this for defined value construct, I can work with its triples and then conditionally generate code based on that. And another one for each property target, this is where we're querying a triple, and I can I can work with the target in this case, which would be the name object for that triple, and do something based on that, and we'll use that coming up. Meta functions are just a function type in Plex. So you have your function type sys triple, which is normally internal, external, and but we have one that's meta. So meta functions are different from regular functions in that you don't actually call them. It doesn't go away to the called function. It just embeds the function within your calling function, and it has access to the variables and fields in the function that you're calling it from. And the meta functions themselves don't necessarily need to contain the meta code. They can contain action diagram code, but they're useful for anything that you would use in more than one place. So then the code generation, the pluses, some common ones, name defined. We'll take the name of the object in the meta variable and assign it to a Plex field. So it will generate a name statement. Another useful one is the cast to. So that will take the current field that it's working on and cast it, the value of that field, to a Plex field. And then the call, which I've mentioned, you can generate a call statement to, maybe it's the target of an entity selected by function triple. I can conditionally call that. So just to give an example of where we can use this, I've just created a scenario where I have my functions, and at runtime, I want to be able to see what the contents of my local fields or my input parameters. I want to output those to a log message. So obviously I could write that by hand, but it's going to be different for every function. So this is where you would use metacode just to do all the hard work for you and just generate all the log messages to output the values that I want to see. So I would create maybe a function called debug shell that I can inherit. And within that function, I would have subroutines like debug the input fields, local fields, panel fields, etc. And the subroutines would use a metacode to output the value of each of the variable groups. And then I want to be able to provide an option triple to turn on or off whether it generates that code or not. And so to check the field option name triple, I would use some metacode like this. So basically what I'm doing here is just defining all the variables I need. And then I'm setting the current function to a meta variable called +function. And then with that, for defined value, my function, I want to read each property of each triple, the function option name triple. And I'm going to work with the target here, which is going to be the name object. And here I'm going to compare the name object to make sure it's debug. I want to check for that. And then if that's true, then if the value, if it's got a continuation triple and it's set to yes, then I define it to +debug. So then in my other code, anywhere that has +debug defined, it will generate. So if I set my option to value no, then that would be undefined and this wouldn't generate anything. So this is the code to output the field values. So what I'm doing is for each variable in local, I'm calling a meta function. So I'm getting the name of the current variable, assigning it to a field called debug variable name. And then for each field within that variable, I'm getting the name of that field, casting it to a field name field, and then getting the value of that field, casting it to the field value field. And then I'll do a format message to format it in variable field equals value. And then I'll do a log message. So when I run this in my function or generate my function, it will just generate basically the name statement, the cast statement, and the format message and log message for every field in my function or local field, and then at runtime I can see those values. So I can just copy that meta function. I can call it for if I want to check my input parameters, my output parameters, panel fields. It's just the same meta function. And I've made it very simple, so I could add extra functionality to my meta function to include structured fields, arrays, etc. And then at runtime, maybe I might set up a key code in my function. So any particular moment, I can press maybe Control F1, and it will just output a message log with the values of the fields that I want to see. So just a very simple example there. So yeah, hopefully I'll encourage you to get involved with metacode. If you need to know a bit more, there's the Plex help, obviously, and then in the action diagram palette, we have there's a meta operations folder there, and if you expand it, you'll see the syntax and you'll see all the things that it can do. So obviously a lot more than I can cover. Okay, so I will now hand over to Abram, and he will do his talk on SQL. So I guess I click on this new share here.
You just stop share. Yeah, stop share, and I can take over.
Okay, thanks.
Before we continue, is there any questions or anything that anyone has for Andrew?
We'll deal with the questions at the end, because then we have a better idea of time.
Yeah, that's fine. I lost all my Zoom controls, so I can't see anything. Can everyone see my screen?
Okay, yeah, now we can, yeah.
Yeah, okay, it's looking, okay. I have to do it this way because I guess PowerPoint Online is not like this. So hello, I'm Abram Darnser. I'm a senior consultant with SameFirst. I'm going to get more into generating custom SQL queries from Plex. So in Plex, it does a really good job of allowing us to just focus on model-based development, and it takes care of all the SQL for us. For years, I was a Plex developer without really having to think in depth about what SQL was happening. I just need to set up the logicals and the views and just generate my single fetches and block fetches and just let Plex take care of the rest. The problem is as applications get larger, databases get larger, you get more complex situations and just entirely huge tables to where it's a lot of times this Plex generated SQL will not work or won't fit our needs, or it works, but it's just very slow. Good examples of issues are queries on large data sets. For example, if you're doing a single fetch on a table, you might, sorry, not a single fetch, a fetch next surrogate on a table, you may think, I'm just bringing back one record. That should be really fast. But if you look at the SQL code, it's still going to bring back the full data set. It's just that Plex is then going to do the fetch next and just get the one row from the actual SQL data set. And that is a problem. Real world example, a client and I, we were having an issue where we were doing a fetch next surrogate and two people were getting the same surrogate. It wasn't happening all the time, but it was happening fairly consistently. And in theory, if that takes a couple of milliseconds, that should almost never happen. Well, it turns out it was querying a very large data set, and it was taking upwards of 4 seconds sometimes to bring back what the next surrogate was. And so that now it's easy to see how people were getting the same surrogate and we were getting such messed up data. So fixing this, I'll go into how we fix this in a second, but I just wanted to kind of talk about how these things really do happen in the real world. Other reasons you may want to do this, you have a complex table join. So something that really needs to be more conditional than the normal joins of doing a refers to and the triples. Complex conditions, so a where clause where under certain conditions, it can look totally different ways. This is obviously a problem because let's say you're doing a block fetch on a data set and you have a complex condition. Well, instead of putting in your where clause, you're doing the filtering out after the fact. Well, you're wasting a lot of processing by doing that. You might be bringing back 1,000 records to get 64 records. And so that's just not efficient. And then finally, dynamically generated joins and conditions. So things that are very complex in that sense, custom queries are really going to be a help. So to get around these limitations, Plex has two features, the select where and the exec SQL. You might be familiar with this. These might be new to you. I just know that for the first, like, I don't know, 5 years of my Plex development, I didn't really mess with these as much as I probably should have. And as things got more complex and I got into more complex situations, and also got much more obsessed with efficiency and quick processing, I use these almost all the time. So to start out, the select where, it's a very simple statement. It will retrieve a set of rows from the database that match the selection criteria that are listed in a field value. So essentially you say select where, and then you have your Plex field. So in your Plex field will be your where condition. It does not need to include the term where. If you're just saying where company ID equals 1, you would just set your field equal to company ID equals 1. So this will use the same view object that the function is using. This will use, so it'll be selecting the same fields, using the same sorting, and hitting the same tables or logicals as it would be normally. The only thing you're editing is the actual where clause itself. So this is excellent for just if I don't need to do any joins, I don't need to do anything, I just need maybe a dynamically generated where clause. So a good example of this, and I'll show this in a second, is for like filtering logic. Instead of doing filtering after the fact, you can have code that dynamically builds a where clause based on whether they pass in filter logic or not. But bad news for RPG server developers, this is not supported. The good news is RPG and the IBMI are pretty good data bulldozers, so it's not the biggest deal, but especially for people who went from doing the AS400 to maybe SQL Server or something, this is something that we've seen a lot, where, you know, just the way you did it back then is not really going to work in these other environments, because it's not a mid-range system that can just kind of plow through the data like the IBMI. So an example of the select where, so excuse me for alt-tabbing for a second. This is actually from the workshop model of last year. And so I just had a filter where we could filter on the movie, on the actual movie name itself. And so you can see here, this, let me show, not tell. This just inherits from a normal block fetch function. So all the code running in the background is just the block fetch. And so all I do is kind of, and to tie back to Andrew's meta stuff, is I undefine the subroutine for the normal block fetch code, and I have my custom code to get the data set. So very simple code to start out. If this selection field is passed in is not blank, then I do a format message. And when you're doing select wheres and exec SQLs, you'll see in a little bit, format message is your best friend. So you can see here I'm format messaging into a local field called SQL where, and I'm just doing an uppercase comparison of the movie name on the table compared to an uppercase comparison on whatever they're filtering on. And so this really would not be possible just by doing a restrict on this field, for example. So yeah, common old Plex practices would be you'd have a block fetch wrapper and a bunch of different block fetches that you would conditionally call. I personally think this is much cleaner and much nicer and much less to maintain. Okay, so, and you can see just as an else, because I do need to have some form of where clause, otherwise the Plex statement's going to error out. I just have a basic statement where I have the key on the table is greater than 0. So a lot of times what you'll probably want to do if you don't have a filter that you need to use all the time, is you want just some generic base filter that you know will catch everything. So in this case, I have just movie ID greater than 0. And so then we'll just do a select where on that. So whichever condition happens, just going to do a where select on it. And then we just have our normal processing. I just literally copy pasted this from the Plex, the normal Plex pattern code. So just to show you what it generates. So here's, I understand that everybody's a Java developer, but you can kind of see the SQL in here. So you can see here, we just have our SQL that Plex would generate. it's missing the where clause. So it passes in the where string, and then there is a select where method in Plex that will just pass in that where clause. And the Plex runtime will then just compile the SQL and run it. So that's select where. Select where is very good for single table fetches with dynamic filtering. So here, let me go back. But the more powerful tool, and the one that I use the most, is exec.sql. This allows you to run completely custom SQL in your action diagram. Granted, it is more work to implement than select where, but having that amount of power at your fingertips, especially if you make a good pattern to use this, it's the most valuable thing that I probably use in Plex all the time. So this can only really be used for functions. This can only be used once for functions that have a fetch next. So, for example, if you're using this as a fetch, a block fetch, single fetch, check row, things like that, then you'll only be able to use one exec.sql statement per function. But if you're doing inserts and updates and deletes, you can put as many of those as you want in your function. I'm not really sure why you would want to do that. I think that's kind of not great practice. You probably want to break that code up into separate functions, but you have that option available. So the syntax is you just do exec.sql and then a source code object. So the source code object will contain all the SQL that you need to run. So again, this is the most powerful SQL tool at your disposal in Plex. It's perfect for all complex, dynamically generated queries, joins, everything. I've done just gigantic queries with this thing, and you can put together patterns that make it work. But like I said, it is more complicated to use. So it does work best if you kind of create your own SQL, your own fetch patterns using this to you basically make the most of it and make your development time as efficient as possible. And again, bad news for RPG developers, this is not supported in RPG, so unfortunately. So here, let me just show you an example before I go into kind of my warnings and things to watch out for. So here is actually the workshop I did in 2017. So if you ever want to just steal some code of mine, here's your opportunity. So I have some basic patterns for block fetches and single fetches. Just from experience, when you create a pattern, they always need to have a view object in it, and the view object needs to have a field. So essentially, the way I get around this is I just create a kind of stub entity with a single field in it. My queries will never actually use this view. It's just there to kind of trick the Plex runtime and to make it work. All actual querying and data will come from this local field called SQL data. And so essentially all the pattern does is this is my block fetch. So I set up what the maximum number of rows I would fetch. So in this case, 64. If the control is set to yes, then I run my exec.sql statement. And then we do a while loop to process through it. I put in some proper edit points to build the output, to set row usage. And then all of this is then set to a fetch data. So you can see here, I do my exec.sql. Here's my source code object. And anything fetched will go into this SQL data, the fields in this SQL data variable. And so then I do my processing. And so think of SQL data as the view, essentially, for this pattern. And then you could set whatever's fetched into my fetch data and its output. So how does that look in practice and actually using it? So here's a function. And so essentially, I do kind of what I talked about earlier, where I want to just set up a base where clause that I know will always be available. Some cases you're restricting on something, and that can be your base where clause. In this case, I'm not restricting on anything. So I just want to put like a just catch all in my where clause. So just in case we're not filtering on anything, then we'll just get everything. So you can see I format into this local SQL string, and where the session ID is greater than 0. So then if the track 1 is, if they don't want to see track 1, so if track 1 is not yes, then I add to my query. So I format to this build and I concat. So basically now I would be saying fetch all the ones where session ID is greater than 0 and session type does not equal track 1. And if for some reason I want to see track 2 either, we would append that. track 3, we would append that. And if they want to hide older sessions, so then I can add, you can see here I'm doing some SQL datetime stuff where I only show sessions that are going to happen in the future, not ones that have happened already. So doing all this, I've built my custom where clause. And so let's look at my exec SQL. You can see I'm just passing in that local field that I'm building for the where clause. And you can see here is here's the query. So this is everything I'm fetching. And this is all my joins. You can see my where clause being passed in and all the ordering that I'm doing. And so from there, I just have some simple, and I'm doing some data formatting. This was just because of the way I wanted the thing to look. So I'm just formatting the dates to look more normal. But other than that, this is pretty standard stuff. And so you can see here in my SQL data local variable, I have all my fields listed. And it's tough to tell because I can't show both windows at the same time, but the order of the fields in the SQL data variable needs to coincide with the order they are in your select. So if you have them out of order, if the data types match, Plex will just put it in whatever one is in the order. So even if I'm selecting company ID first, if I say store ID is my first one, it's going to put company ID in my store ID field. So just be careful there. So ordering is important there. So what are the kind of pitfalls that you can run into here? So it can be very picky. There is a triple that you need to put on, that you might have to put on your source code object that you're using for your exec SQL, SQL statement type. So the general rule that I say, that I tell people when I teach people about this, is you need to set this triple to unprepared on any object where the where clause is completely dynamic. Plex Help has some further explanation on the rules, but it's a little difficult to understand, to be honest. But this is the general rule that I've always kind of followed, and it's always worked. For example, so you can see from my example here, let me find my source code object. 1 moment. You can see here I have the SQL statement type set to unprepared, and that's because I'm completely setting my where clause dynamically. If you're doing something like that, for example, then you don't want that triple. So you can have ones where you just have the where clause, laid out, and maybe other parts of your query need to be dynamic. Then you do not need the unprepared. So that's that's the first tip. And honestly, if you're getting started with this and you didn't know that, that's the part that's going to make you want to pull your hair out. But once you know that and you kind of follow that rule, it's just not a problem anymore. So yeah, I already kind of touched on this. The field ordering of your fetch next needs to match what's in your query. And so one thing in the example that I kind of talked about earlier, where things were taking so long to get the fetch next surrogate, it was actually a very simple fix. We just had to add a bit of SQL that's not normally available in Plex's repertoire. And all we had to do was say, select top 1 of the surrogate, and it was back to being instantaneous, and the problem literally disappeared the moment that was deployed. And so that's great and all, but select top 1, that is SQL Server specific SQL. If you've ever written SQL for IBMI, you would know that fetch 1 row only is actually the last statement, the last line of the SQL statement that you're put. And so what you'll find is there are little idiosyncrasies between SQL queries on different systems, MySQL, SQL Server, IBMI. So these are things that you have to be careful of. And if you don't foresee yourself ever leaving a database, maybe you don't worry about it, but I do think it's generally a better idea to kind of think about these things. So one thing you could do in your patterns is using meta variables and things. When you have these database specific parts of your query, kind of house those parts in meta tags, and that way you can just switch your configuration, regenerate your functions, and your SQL will be of the proper type. So that's just something to kind of think about when doing this. So yeah, that's really all I had. I don't know who this might be new to, but I do strongly encourage you to check this out if you haven't, because you can really take slow functionality and make it lightning quick very easily. And I'll pass it on to Kiyoshi.
Okay. Thank you, Ebrahim. I kind of remind me of what I implement for Java and C# for the execute and self-fair. But yeah.
Yeah, I didn't mean to throw you under the bus for the documentation.
Yeah, you have a couple of questions. Yeah, for your stuff. So.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, you can probably type down. Okay, so I'm going to talk model API, which well, I wasn't using when I was for CA or sign-on or starting data, but now after I left, this is the one I mostly spend with Plex. Still not lot of time I spend with Plex IDE, but this is the one that I spend a lot of time for the various reasons. So model API, well, it has I don't go everything, but there's a big chunk of Plex help available. By the way, you see screen, right? Yeah, okay. So it's basically model API. Just you can access Plex model without using Plex IDE. That's kind of purpose. And so you could do massive object creation or triple creation, or sometimes you can query object information, what's the triple associated, etc. And also, you could request a gen and build from outside. So it can help a little bit to some like night build automation, gen build automation if you want. Also, of course, if you inject a process as part of scripting, well, you could do some nice DevOps for sure. But which, the model API is meant to for non-Plex ID means you need to code something. So the something is kind of a hard step to take, but yeah, I'm using normally C#. I mean, you could use C++, you could use C#, you could use Java. I mean, but of course, this guy is COM based, so it's kind of Microsoft friendly. And I know better than C++. I mean, I know the C# better than C++, so I'm just doing it. But using C# or .NET to do that, you just need to import COM reference to your native C# project, and everything is available for you to use. So once you kind of pass that entry point, it's kind of very easy to understand. You don't need to go to the Plex help. It's all the method references, etc. is available for you, just to, in this sense, tell you. So why I need to use quite a lot these days. So have a, well, this is just a 2 example, but so first one is, so I don't know, you maybe have seen the Plex local model or group model when you log in, I think. It complains about higher surrogate number. I remember back in, I don't know, Plex 5X or some version, there was a problem. The surrogate number with negative is updated to group model. If you don't know, if you create an object in the local model, very first time, it's just assigned to the like a temporary negative surrogate. And that's indicate the object is only existing in your local model. And then when you update the group model, it's kind of reassign the highest surrogate number and then make it positive and so on. So that's kind of normal process, but there were bugs in that update process, and then negative is kind of stored as to the group model. So then what's happened is a negative, become like a reversed byte, and it's very get higher number, and then it's kind of Plex is mistaken that number, and then start from that very high number to allocate them, from now on, I mean, from there. So as a result, some local model, especially maybe you guys already have that situation, but so there's a huge gap between the surrogate number in your local model. And of course, that's a kind of started 16-bit data Plex model, etc., still 32-bit. And yeah, that's kind of scary. And I mean, Plex showed some scary message when you have that surrogate issue, you only have left certain number, etc. But technically, there's no way to do. And got two actually customer kind of contact us. Well, yeah, contact us to contact me. Then, so the idea I kind of tried is just to clone clone the local model and then recreate the brand new local model. Updated to the brand new group model. So at least the kind of local model clone to the other local model, which is created by the brand new group model set. Of course, library, etc., is set the same way, but then just update back to. So at least the surrogate is sorted out because it's reassigning everything from scratch. Well, I don't go detail too much, but you lost a lot of things, but at least the local model is life, or group model life is back. And then those people kind of accepted those limitations, then they kind of using it right now. Okay, so that's one kind of real high usage. I mean, you could say why you cannot use XML export import maybe, but it doesn't work for the huge model. So just a Plex die. So it's no way. Just a small sample, tiny kind of thing, it works, just make it fun. But if you do the historical big model, it's never. And also it doesn't sort out the inheritance sequence very well. So your result is sometimes crap. Yeah, so that's fine. Yep, and what I did for that is kind of extract triples, extract action diagram, extract panel, everything as a text file or JSON file, whatever, then be imported using model API. Then just to do that, just to define the sequence, etc. So that's kind of a neat project. And then the other one, obviously I'm working for the new production web IT, and then kind of I need to get a lot of information from the model. So I just getting lots of stuff from there. Then just migrate it to the new graph database or whatever. That's the heavy usage. Well, there's a huge limitation. I don't think Broadcom never changed it, but model API instance only runs one on your local PC. So that's a little nightmare because you can open a multiple Plex, right? I mean, then you can do lots of jobs just side by side, etc. But this common interface for the Plex API just grabbing one instance of Plex, so it doesn't. You cannot switch or you cannot have multiple, so that's kind of a limitation. But if you do automation at night, no one there, and that's probably okay. And I also, my code I wrote, I have lots of make sure nothing run, no Plex running, I kill the Plex, etc. And then make sure that after I've done the release all the resources. So those parts probably not documented in Plex online help, but kind of I sort out. So that's why I can run like this model API like like 8 hour, 2 days or whatever. So that's the thing. So well, I just created some simple app. Well, so combined with yeah, I just create a console application who received Plex object ID. So this is again a little strange concept. It's not surrogate, but it's object ID. So it's like a really strange concept. But you can think it's like a memory allocation, memory address at the moment of that object in current open Plex model. So it's not surrogate, but yeah, they do that. Well, I just put some query APIs. You can see some information on the DOS when I do that. And I use the add-ins. So this is the other thing I may touch maybe late the session, but this add-in is available. You can pass some predefined macro through the object browser, and then you can just use that as input parameter, and then you can use for the model API. So just show something here. First, just a running one. Okay, so I have created add-ins. Well, there's edit add-in, and so yeah. So I just created one Plex conference 2020 exe, and then passing something called object relation macro. So this is predefined. I think it's documented somewhere in the Plex model. I mean Plex help. Okay, so if I select well any object, and then so if you do that added, so it's listed here as an extra menu. Okay, so if I click that, and then so this is function. So I'm telling function name and the local model path and the function name and the function languages and the input name and the narrative of that object, and then some just locally defined action diagram, which is really silly, but that kind of thing you can do. So if I go to maybe entity, then of course entity doesn't have the same information, so it just to show up entity. But if I go to table, table, yeah, I think it showed the JDBC and the input name and the table name. I don't have narrative for that, that's why it doesn't show up. But if I put the narrative, then you see narrative as well. So that's just very silly, but that's kind of capability. So what's happening here is when when right click on this one, and then it's passing this Plex table's kind of a temporary ID to the program I wrote. And then if you receive it, and then I spend a little bit on the code because I know it's little. So this is the ID you get. So this is kind of memory, a memory allocation pointer. And then what I'm doing, especially just the triple part. Okay, so this is a kind of reference to the com wrapper Plex API. So there's a method called get the triples by source. Okay, so I know the source, right? This is like maybe physical table, this may be entity, or this may be function. So just to return all the triples defined to this object by passing ID. And then you get the triples. Well, just check if just has any triple or not, and then come here. So just the looping is triple, because at this point, triple is just a number. So it's just a sequence of number array list. So what you do next is, so you try to get the Bob. So, well, there's a two thing needed, but it's once you get the triple ID, because triple ID should have different source object and target object and Bob. So if you just ask, get back Bob information for that this triple, and then you get the something back. So Bob name, yeah. And then, so I'm checking like languages or input name exists. I mean, if this Bob name is that, because Plex hold like a function languages or table languages or view languages, etc. It's a different triple, but I'm just checking end with. So same for input name. So you can do that, and you get, if that much just coming to the inside. So like a function, if you have function and the function languages exist, I hope. Well, no, sometimes not, but it exists. Then they come inside, and then I just query the target object of that triple. So if you know, just same kind of concept, you get the target object reference, then you get the target object name using the API. So then, yeah, I mean, then just the console out. So that's a language is that. So that's kind of basic idea. So it's one thing very strange is most likely you need to have always do the two-step. So one is something get a reference of like an ID or address. Then you actually can get actual data for the object. So that's kind of two pair. Then you get almost everything. So that's kind of okay. So of course, yeah. I mean, I don't know have anything complicated here, but okay. Yeah. So well, this is actual action diagram defined locally as the edit function. So of course, you can dump out this to text, etc. But you know, and then you can re-import this to using model API too. So that's kind of a what I did for the model cloning. Okay, I think that's about.
Okay, so yeah,
Yep.
thanks, Kyoshi.
Yep.
So there were a few questions. I think Abram's been answering about the prepared and unprepared triples for the source code objects. So there's a question for you, Kyoshi. Is every Plex item an int name pair or just triples?
Meaning like when you were getting the int and then getting the name from it, is that the way you would access like action diagram lines as well? Or is that just going to be like large properties?
Okay, yeah, action diagram or panel design is just a huge, giant, one single string property. Okay. So you cannot access like a line by line or etc. So the import export is just kind of all swapping, replacing. So if you want to do something fancy to inject, you need to do after you extract as text, you need to do something outside of Plex, just a kind of editing text file. And then you could inject if you know the syntax, etc.
Yeah, I kind of do. I do touch on that a little bit, and I think later. But I guess my question is: does the int and like the object surrogate, or those seem like they'd be two separate things, correct?
Yeah, it's a two separate thing.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not. It's a so that's why. So I think object to property. No, information, I think. So this is surrogate. You see my screen, right? Yeah. So this is surrogate, but I don't know. I don't know the history, but this is not used by like an ID I use. So there's a like a really memory address pointer. So it's only available at this moment of this Plex model, Plex instance, or opening the Plex local model. So if you close the local model, reopen the same thing, it's changed.
Mm-hmm.
So surrogate is concrete, but so this is the one that it's a positive, so it means it's existing the group model, but it's sometimes negative. And then there's an API to get surrogate as well. So then from that pointer to get surrogate, so you could do that.
Okay, so we'll have to kind of move on. So
yep.
There was a question for Abram.
Yeah.
Do you have a model?
Yeah, Mark, both models actually showed today were the previous two conference workshop models. They should be available on CMFirst support site. So cmfirstgroup.com/support. But if for whatever reason, if you're having trouble finding them, just message me directly. I can zip them up and send them. But the entire workshops and everything there should be available through our knowledge base on our support site.
Yeah, and our emails are available so throughout the conference. So yeah, please contact us if you have any questions or need to learn more about these topics. But I think we'll wrap up now and give you a few minutes before you switch over to the next session. So thanks everyone, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yes, thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, to answer what Jeremy said about SQL injection, yes, you don't want to be too generic about it. If you'll see in the patterns, everything that I do is literally set around the idea of a single field being mapped into a single thing, which makes injection very difficult. But yeah, if you're just super generic about it, you really do have to be careful. Jeremy, anything else you wanted to add on that?
Well, I mean, that's a perfect area of the combine with the meta and yeah, the
that's true.
SQL stuff. And then how much you spend versus how much you
the general
accept,
recommendation
like
that I can
coding.
find online is that you should always search any strings and replace any apostrophes which end a string with a double apostrophe. So if you've got your own patterns to do your where clauses, if you can search for string types and go through a quick API to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there are also certain times that Plex does require you to do double apostrophe, and I just remembered that, and I can't think of all the situations where that is necessary, but there are some. But just a plug, I believe we are, I think in the lightning talk, we're talking about a pattern we created to better, to auto-generate better SQL as well if you don't want to do it in more of a custom route. So.
Your timing was perfect. That was exactly 1 hour. So I think at this point, we're going to start our next session, which is outside the lines. And let me bring that up.
Maybe
you want to pause and restart the recording?
Yeah, that's probably better. Stop recording and then restart a new one.